So, of course, on one hand, I do what I do with the church, but I also have this weird thing that I do online. And Scott Adams, who was the creator of the Dilbert comic strip for the last number of years, at every morning would be on YouTube and Rumble and a bunch of these other platforms and giving people his hot takes on life and politics and whatever. He passed this week. And I noticed that in contrast to what I've seen in churches, there's an interesting thing going on in our culture where people who no longer go to church are now doing what would have done in church. They're doing it on the internet together. Scott Adams created for his little group something that he called the simultaneous sip, which looks surprisingly like the kind of thing that we might see in communion in church. People are getting their needs met online, including needs that the church used to meet. But that doesn't mean that Jesus is going away anytime soon from the cultural consciousness. In fact, if there's anything that's really hot to talk about online, it's religion and politics. And a culture war is really a war within a religion. And the so-called culture war that we've been talking about for the last few decades is often really a difference between takes on Jesus and Christianity. We're against people using religious language to gain political support, usually until someone uses religious language to support our political views, and then we like it. So on one hand, a big conversation about Christian nationalism, and then a young representative from Texas is running for Senate using a lot of Christian language from the other side. And that's actually very normal. That's actually the way it almost always works. Religion is dollars and politics is cents. Religion is always and politics is now. Because politics is how do you relate to your neighbor? Jesus says, love your neighbor, and we all sort of ask, well, what does love really look like in all of these different situations and contexts? Now, last week we had Jesus' first sign, which was turning water to wine at Cana. While it's a rather surprising miracle, where Jesus basically delivers an enormous amount of wine to a group of people that probably had already drank too much, nobody objects to that miracle. Because even as we talked about it in the context of the sermon, Jesus responds to our needs. Mary directs the servants. Water is turned into wine, and the catastrophe of the wedding banquet / world is averted, and a joyful world-creating celebration ensues. Who wouldn't like something like that? But Jesus was remarkably hard to wield. On one occasion, when some of his adversaries tried to trap him, they asked him a question. Should you pay taxes? Oh my. Especially taxes to Caesar. Especially taxes to Caesar because Caesar's coins had on them a graven image of Caesar himself, who claimed to be a god. And so this was the kinds of question that Jesus' adversaries knew would put him in a corner because, and of course this never happens in politics, where you get a politician on stage and you ask him a question where no matter which way he answers, some constituency is going to be furious at him. So they asked Jesus, should you pay taxes to Caesar, this man who claims to be a god or the son of a god, or not? Jesus says, bring me a denarius. So they bring him a coin. And he says, whose image is on it? And they said, Caesar's. And Jesus replied, give back to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's. And they were amazed at him because they set a trap for him and he got out. But when you think about this answer, well, it sort of puts you in a quandary. Because, of course, well, what is Caesar's? But isn't everything that belongs to Caesar, doesn't that belong to God? So what has Jesus done? Now, we're going to be looking at one of the most famous things that Jesus ever did. One of the most famous things that Jesus ever did. It's written up in all four Gospels. It is Jesus at the temple overturning the tables of the money changers. And this is the one incident where Jesus did something that could be construed as semi-violent, or at least forceful and persuasive. And it was sort of revolutionary. But right away, when you have to deal with this text, one of the things that comes up is it happens at the end of the story in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and is at the beginning of the story in John, and this then sets a whole bunch of discussion underway. Now, when you look at the story in Mark, Matthew, and Luke, the basic pattern is the same, even though some of the details are different. And that's pretty common with respect to stories in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. In Mark, Jesus curses a fig tree, and then he drives out the buyers and the sellers from the temple, and he quotes from the Old Testament, this should be a house of prayer for all nations, but you've turned it into a den of robbers, which is a take from Isaiah 56 and Jeremiah 7. And then his disciples see the withered tree, and then Jesus' authority is questioned. Now, the order's a little bit different in Matthew, and Luke omits completely the cursing of the fig tree, which is another thing that has tended to bother people. Why would Jesus do that to a poor fig tree? And which is always an ironic thing for us who sit on wooden chairs, to care so much for the life of that tree. Now, in John, however, it comes at the beginning of the book, and if you study these books long enough, you know that the authors usually lay things out in a thematic way. And so in chapter 2, last week we talked about Jesus at Cana turns water to wine. And as we talked about in the sermon, the Creator God is here to redeem and rescue. If I could summarize that sermon in one sentence, there it would be. Now, in the second story, Jesus clears the temple courts. And the language in John, not in Matthew, Mark, or Luke, is that this is, and then a sign of his authority is demanded. And last week we talked a lot about this word sign, because it's an important word in the Gospel of John. And then Jesus also, and we'll read this, you don't have to squint too hard because we will read it. Jesus then connects himself quite tightly to the temple, but in a strange way. And now next week, we are going to be in another famous chapter in John where Nicodemus, a ruling Pharisee on the Sanhedrin, comes to Jesus at night and has questions for him. And Jesus will very famously say to him, "You must be born from above." So we'll get into more of that next week. But as you can see in the Gospel of John, John is stacking these stories up for a reason. He wants us to understand these stories as a sequence, and the sequence is important. Now, we tend to be unfamiliar with what temples were in the ancient world. When we think about a church building, while there's some continuity, is quite a bit different from what a temple was, especially here in America where we have this separation of church and state. Temples are not apolitical. Temples are completely political, because generally speaking, kings build them. And we might wonder why. Well, it has everything to do with the flourishing of your nation. Now, if you go into the book of 1 Kings, you will meet Ahab and Jezebel. Ahab builds a new capital city in Samaria, and he marries a princess from Tyre in order to cement those bonds. And Jezebel then will build in Samaria a temple to her god. Why would they do something like that? Well, because you have to be cemented into the power from above that will bring flourishing and protection to your nation. You'll also see that Israel and Judah, when they became vassals of other empires, like the Babylonians or the Assyrians, they would copy the altars, for the example of Damascus and the northern kingdom in Samaria. They would copy the altar of Damascus and duplicate it in Samaria so that the king of Israel will worship the god of Damascus or Assyria, because that's where your power comes from. Temples are all about prosperity and security from the gods. Success comes from heaven, and if you want success from heaven to be stabilized and permanent, you had better build a temple. Israel's God, however, is a jealous God, and so when Israel would build temples to other gods in their midst or have sacrifices and altars in their midst, God would complain. You'll find that in the book of Judges. You'll find that in the book of Kings. Foreign temples for political reasons became a real problem for Israel. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make a graven image of anything in heaven above or on earth below to represent the Lord Israel's God. You shall not bow down to them or serve them. And for this reason, that coin with Caesar's face on it was a stumbling block. And we'll talk about that in a minute. Now, the Romans learned this about the Jews and saw that, because of what happened with the Greeks, if you force those Jews to put your gods in their temple, you will have nothing but political turmoil with them. So the easiest thing to do with that strange people is let them have their temple, let them have their God, don't push it. And that's what the Romans did for the most part, until other things would happen. Now, temples were functional for flourishing. A temple was the house where the god lived. The temple was the place where the god would be fed through the sacrifices and the offerings. The temple was the place where you would go to meet the god, to give the god what he wanted, so hopefully in exchange the god would give you what you wanted. And of course, the king was front and center with all of this. The temple was an embassy of God, and it was in some senses a miniature of the cosmos, whereby the functionality of the world could be managed and processed. This was true of Israel, and this was true of many of her neighbors. A temple was a microcosm of the cosmos, and relations in the temple create the situation in the land. But the Israelites were always strange. Now, I mentioned worshiping of other gods in the book of Judges and in the book of Kings, but in the book of Samuel, there gets expressed a degree of ambiguity around kingship and temples. You might recall that David, after the Lord had given him rest against his enemies, he put down the Philistines, he put down all of his neighbors around him. The first thing David wants to do is build a temple. Why? Because the temple secures God in his corner. And so David says to Nathan, I'm ready to build God a temple. And Nathan says, sounds great. It's conventional wisdom, everyone would do it. And then the Lord comes to Nathan and says, tell him no, I don't want one. What? And the Lord basically says, I've been coming and going. I've been living in a tent. I've been living amongst you. And, well, why? David, are you wanting to build this temple because you want to put me in a box? Because you want to domesticate me and feed me and make me your tool? Now, Israel's God always resisted a bit of religious transactionalism. What do I mean by that? John Walton is an Old Testament scholar, and he did an exhaustive study of the ancient Near East texts that have been unearthed in the last few hundred years that gives us a lot of insight into what did Israel's neighbors do with respect to temples. And a lot of the things are the same, except that when you read the oracles of the priests and prophets of the Egyptians and the Babylonians and the Assyrians and all of these neighbors, you would hear them say, come to the temple and do your sacrifices. You'd better do your sacrifices or the gods will be angry. And the Romans did the same thing. You'd better do your sacrifices or the gods will be angry. Do your sacrifices. Now, you will find commandments to sacrifice in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, but when you read the Old Testament, you learn that Israel's God is a little bit different. In the rest of the nations, do your sacrifices and have your God bless you, but you can pretty much do whatever you want for the rest of your life. Israel's God is concerned about all sorts of other things. How are you treating your neighbor? How are you treating the poor? How are you treating the foreigner? How are you relating to me as your God? In fact, Israel's God keeps pounding on these kinds of issues, even to the point that you will find repeated in the Old Testament prophets, obedience is better than sacrifices. And John Walton says, you won't hear that from the other priests, but you do hear that from Israel's God. And it's a strange thing. Why would Israel's God care about how we treat our slaves, or how we treat our animals, or how we treat the ground, or how we treat our neighbors? Shouldn't he just want to be paid off? The American government doesn't really care, at least within certain bounds, how you treat your spouse or your kids. They do care that you pay your taxes. And that's basically how they imagined the gods worked. Now, by the time we get to Jesus, we're in what's called the Second Temple, the temple that had been rebuilt after the Babylonians destroyed the first one. And Herod went on to a 40-plus year refurbishing program to make the temple in Jerusalem glorious. Now, Herod the Great didn't do this out of the kindness of his heart. He did this for very rational reasons. He wanted Israel's God to bless him. He wanted the people to love him. And so he poured enormous amounts of money and time into making that temple glorious. And he wanted to be seen as a Messiah. Because if you read the prophets, the temple and the Messiah are tightly connected. Now, it didn't work out too well for Herod the Great. Everybody hated him because he tended to kill a lot of people. But including his own family, including his own sons. But that was Herod the Great. When it was time, almost time for the Jewish Passover, Jesus went up to Jerusalem. It's on a hill. In the temple courts, he found people selling cattle, sheep, and doves, and others sitting at tables exchanging money. Well, why? Well, let's imagine that you're a faithful, observant Jew, and you live in Ephesus, and you're going to go to Jerusalem to give the prescribed sacrifices. Are you going to go with sheep and goats on this boat from Ephesus into the harbor in Caesarea and take those animals all the way to Jerusalem? No. What are you going to take with you? Money. You're going to take money with you. You're going to take money from Ephesus with you. So you're going to go to Jerusalem, and if you want to facilitate the religion, sell the sacrificial animals to the people. So that's why you have cattle, sheep, and doves. Well, what about the money changers? Well, if you're leaving Ephesus, you've got coins in your pocket, and when you get to Jerusalem, guess what all these coins are going to have on their face? Pictures of gods and emperors and heroes. Are you going to bring that into the sanctuary? No. You'd better change that money, because Herod knew this. So when Herod made coins, he put a reed on the coin. Nice and symbolic. No graven image. So it just makes perfect sense. If you're going to facilitate faithful Jews practicing their religion in Jerusalem, you need money changing and you need animal sales. And outside of Jerusalem, a lot of this was happening. But in this case, they're doing it in a place in the temple called the Court of the Gentiles, because of the Old Testament system, you had the Holy of Holies at the center. Then you had the holy place next to it where the priests would do things. And then you'd have another court where Jewish men could go if they were completely bodily intact and ceremonially clean. They could pray there. Then you had another court, which was the court of the women, where Jewish women who were ceremonially clean could pray there. And then you had the court of the Gentiles, where Gentiles who wanted to pray to Israel's God could go and pray at the temple, but they could not get past a certain point with Jewish women and then Jewish men. And this is where Jesus discovers they've got animals, they've got money changers, and Jesus isn't having it. So he made a whip out of cords and drove all from the temple courts, both sheep and cattle, and he scattered the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. To those who sold doves, he said, "Get these out of here. Stop turning my Father's house into a market." His disciples remembered that it is written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." Now, on one hand, the logic is pretty clear. This is the court of the Gentiles, and the Matthew, Mark, and Luke quotations emphasize the idea that this is a place for Gentiles to pray, and you are keeping the Gentiles out with your money selling and your animal selling. So it makes good sense, and this is something that's very much in alignment with what the Old Testament would see as a messianic action. Now, the quote in John, though, is different. And here's a little tip for you. If you ever find a quote in the New Testament, which the New Testament is filled with, go back and read a little bit more context from the Old Testament. Psalm 69, Lord, the Lord Almighty, may those who hope in you not be disgraced because of me, God of Israel. May those who seek you not be put to shame because of me. For I endure scorn for your sake, and shame covers my face. I am a foreigner to my own family, a stranger to my own mother's children. For zeal for your house consumes me, and the insults of those who insult you fall on me. When I weep and fast, I must endure scorn. When I put on sackcloth, people make sport of me. Those who sit at the gate mock me. I am the song of the drunkards. Seems like a strange song for them to quote, unless you continue to know more of the story. And as we've already been seeing in the Gospel of John, this gospel is written in retrospect. And the disciples, when things happen, they're sort of confused and clueless. But years later, they look back, and you'll see it here. His disciples remember that it is written, zeal for your house will consume me. But why would Psalm 69 speak of Jesus? If you look at the Matthew, Mark, and Luke quotes, like I noted, Jeremiah 7, which is a very interesting passage, because at that point, Judah was feeling pressure from surrounding nations, and there were groups in Judah saying, God will never let our city be captured because we have the temple of the Lord. And Jeremiah comes and says, You all live dissolute lives. You're in no way following my covenant, but you're trying to use the temple as an idol, as a protective talisman to keep your city safe from the Babylonians. And Jeremiah will say, God cannot be put in a box. The Babylonians are going to come, and God is going to let them take apart his temple and take you away. Isaiah 56 is a prophecy given to eunuchs. Now, a eunuch could not enter into the place where Jewish men could go because the eunuch had been dismembered. And a eunuch cannot have a family. And Isaiah 56 is a very strange prophecy where Isaiah says eunuchs will have a future, even though they have quite physically been cut off. To them I will give within my temple and its walls a memorial and a name better than sons and daughters. Then the Jews responded to him after Jesus did all of this mess-making in the court of the Gentiles and asked, what sign, again, that word does not appear in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, what sign can you show us to prove your authority to do all this? We're in the book of signs, remember. Jesus answered them, destroy this temple, and I will raise it again in 3 days. Now, what we're going to see this week and next week again with Nicodemus is that there's a pattern in the Gospel of John where Jesus says something and everybody takes him the wrong way. Now, in internet parlance, we call this the literal internet. You can say something and everybody takes it very literally. And you're going to see this week and you're going to see this next week. But Jesus is doing this on purpose. Jesus is shaking up their frames. He says, destroy this temple. And they're like, destroy the temple? What do you mean destroy the temple? And you'll raise it up in 3 days? It's just crazy talk. It has taken 46 years for Herod to remodel this temple, and you're going to raise it in 3 days? But the temple that he was spoken of was his body. And after he was raised from the dead, his disciples recalled what he had said. Then they believed the scriptures and the words that Jesus had spoken. And again, we saw this last week. You have this seeing, there's a mystery, there's confusion, and then there's belief. And we're going to find this pattern again and again and again in the Gospel of John. Now, while he was in Jerusalem at the Passover festival, many people saw the signs he was performing and believed in his name. The ambiguities are going to continue to linger. They had a temple, which made things intelligible, but it also led them down the wrong path. See, the temple was always a sign of God's presence. Every nation got that. God would not permit the temple to become an idol. God would not be manipulated in Jeremiah 7. God could not be limited by the temple. You see that in Isaiah 56. The temple pointed to Jesus and the rupture between God and his creation. The only reason you need a temple is because it's ruptured. I often point out that altars are ubiquitous in the ancient world, but when you begin reading the Bible, Genesis 1, it's a temple text, but there's no temple in it. Genesis 2 and 3, now we're in the garden. We have the temple in Genesis 1. We have the garden in Genesis 2. Every palace has a garden. But you know what you don't find in Genesis 1, 2, or 3? You don't find an altar. What do you find in Genesis 4? Cain and Abel fighting over an altar because heaven and earth have been ruptured. You see this all the way already in the prologue of the Gospel of John. He was in the world, and though the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him. Think about Psalm 69. He came to that which was his own, but his own did not receive him. The disciples see it all later. I have endured scorn for your sake, and shame covers my face. I am a foreigner to my own family, a stranger to my own mother's children. For zeal for your house consumes me, and the insults of those who insult you fall on me. When I weep and fast, I must endure scorn. When I put on sackcloth, people make sport of me. Those who sit at the gate mock me, and I am the song of drunkards. Before you know it, Jesus will be scorned. Jesus will be mocked. Jesus will be forsaken. Jesus is going to be hauled outside of that city, stripped naked, and put on a cross for the mockery of everyone coming down the road to see. It's already right here in the temple story. Jesus is always such a problem because you just can't wield him. People make arguments about him. People try to copy him. People try to put him in a box. Jesus comes to the box that was made for God and says, it's done. And the truth is, it was. 70 AD, the Romans came in and they wiped it to the ground, and it has never been rebuilt. Why? He displays his power and his glory in the strangest way possible. He becomes the final blood sacrifice. Is there an altar here? Are we killing animals? Are we doing any of that? Why did all of that stop? He claims all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Wow. He wields us, not the other way around. And what he says at the beginning of the book of Acts is, you will be my witnesses. Boy, we sure struggle with that. Because in any given situation, he always seemed to do what no one expected. Oh, Jesus is so nice. He makes water to wine. And then he clears out the court of the Gentiles with a whip. And then when everybody says, who gave you authority to do this? I'll give you a sign. Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I'll raise it up. And they're thinking, what temple? But they will destroy his temple, his body, and in 3 days he'll raise it up. He gives them the sign, but they can't see it in any different way. Now, last week we had water to wine. The Creator God comes in and rescues us from our mess. He rescues the collapsed party of our administration of his creation. This week, he fulfills the temple in spite of us and yet through us. The temple will go away. Why? Because it pointed to someone, and the temple itself could not fully complete it. And so when he dies, what does he say? It is finished. And the curtain is torn in two. The temple is done. We're not in a temple. We're in a church. There is no altar. There is no animal. We have the Lord's table. Next week, we must be born of water and spirit. Oh, is he going to confuse poor Nicodemus? Poor Nicodemus comes in there at night, hiding, worried. Maybe Jesus can give us some clue who he is. And he says to poor Nicodemus, you must be born from above. What do you mean by that? This Jesus cannot be wielded. He only wields. We are, in some ways, the temple, because we are the connecting point between heaven and earth through him. Let's pray. Lord, so often we want you to just be clear with us. We want a simple solution. We want a formula. We want certain steps that will achieve an outcome in the way that our chemistry teachers told us to mix things in a test tube, or our business teachers told us to collect these monies to get an outcome, or any of the ways that we try to manage things below. But Lord, we don't understand that you cannot be wielded by us for political benefit, for economic benefit, that humanity, while it's been building temples and trying to, one way or another, corral the gods and put them in our debt and service, we cannot put you in a box. Lord, help us to worship, because that's what we should do. Help us to obey, because that's what we should do. Give us your Spirit that we might be your witnesses, because that's what you've told us to do. But be patient with us, Lord, as so often, as is seen in almost every story, we unwittingly are wielded by you, whether we're agreeing with you or resisting you. And in the end, we have to pray, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. So give us your peace. In the name of Jesus, amen.